Hello again, time for another video. For this video we will cover the Prince again, this one on the establishment of new principalities. Now, Machiavelli covers this in chapter 6 specifically, and that's the one we're discussing, concerning new principalities which are acquired by one's own arms and ability. The matter of entirely new states is in particular what we're concerned with. Those states which are built by men through their own methods rather than through inheritance or luck. So in other words, you're not the king of France, you're not inheriting a territory and expanding it, nor are you just receiving a title. Rather, you're a person forming a new state through the taking over of an old one, or the conquest of it without any prior state which you are in charge of. Now, Machiavelli starts off talking about the great people of old and notes specifically, a wise man ought to always follow the paths beaten by great men, and to imitate those who have been supreme, so that if his ability does not equal theirs, at least it will savor of it. Now, the reason for this little bit, I do apologize, which you will see later, is because I am not English. I am American. And that's the English spelling, so while I will copy it because that's what's in the book I was reading of The Prince, the English translation, I don't speak it, so not only was it telling me I was wrong on Google Docs when I had to type this up to print it out, but also that's not how I read Saber, so while I will note it, it is spelled differently from how I would in the book. Regardless, the main point here, though, is that if you wish to achieve great things, if you are wise and want to do good, you ought to follow those who have done great things, even greater things than you could physically achieve, because even if you don't line up to their example, it will at least savor of it. It will reflect it in some way. Similar to how Machiavelli uses an archer, but for example, when you fire a gun, say, at a long distance, you aim upwards so that as the bullet travels over distance, it'll fall slightly and you'll still hit your mark. You won't hit where you were aiming necessarily, but you'll still hit in the general vicinity of where you wanted to hit. And so, by copying those men who have done great things, you will be able to effectively achieve great things yourself. Maybe not to their level. Caesar, for example, despite aiming to be Alexander, was unable to conquer as much land as he did, but you'll still be able to reflect it in some way. Caesar's Gallic campaigns were impressive, if destructive. Continuing on, in entirely new principalities where there is a new prince, more or less difficulty is found in keeping them, accordingly as there is more or less ability in him who acquired the state. Essentially, your difficulties in establishing a new state will be entirely dependent on your own skills. A person who is less skilled than others will naturally have greater difficulties with ruling a new state, especially as they will necessarily have to rely on others even more, which creates several openings that a person does not want. Now, some level of reliance on others is necessary when dealing with a state, but it's best to minimize such a thing. And importantly, when it comes down to it, if you aren't as equipped to handle really anything, it could be administration, could be warfare, could be diplomacy, whatever it is, it'll be much harder to deal with that part of a state administration, especially when you are making a new state. If you just inherit a state, you will have people with experience already. You will have institutions dedicated to these tasks who can handle it. You will have entire groups focused on how to manage them within the traditions that you have as a state and the institutions which you have established. But when you're making a new state, those don't really exist, and you're basically having to build everything from scratch, making it far more difficult for the new person who inherits it, as opposed to a person who takes things. So let me rephrase because I made a mistake. It's far harder for a person who takes it and builds a new principality than one who inherits it naturally, because the infrastructure is not there. However, of course, as Machiavelli notes, the more skilled one is, for example, the more educated, capable, and just generally able a prince is, a ruler is, the more or less difficult it will be for them to properly handle this. The more able you are, the less difficult you are. The less able, more difficult. It's a simple inverse. Now, due to a ruler's position when establishing an entirely new state, as we've gone over, they don't have the institutions that a state which has been in existence for a long period has. And so the new ruler must build new institutions and establish precedents as there are none which exist for that state. For example, let's use the U.S. The United States government, when it was formed, had very few institutions, if any. They had to build their own post office, build their own departments for the executive branch, build basically everything from the ground up. They copied a lot of their ideas from English law and the Enlightenment, but it was still fundamentally a new state. They still had to build all of that, establish the precedents which would go into common law, and establish all the rulings which would allow for such a thing. They had to build their new military, get their diplomacy on track, make sure their budget functioned. They had to do all these things to establish their new state so it could function. The same is true of any state when it is newly established. Certainly, a ruler can try to basically just copy and paste from a previous country, but rarely is that effective because what made it work for one country may be different from what makes it work for another, especially if it's in an entirely different area. You can copy word for word every aspect of the German Constitution, French Constitution, US Constitution, whatever, put it in a new state, in a new area. Africa, Asia, South America, even North America for some, and it won't work because those constitutions, those rules, precedents, and institutions were built around that specific country and its specific history and geography. When you make a new state, you can definitely borrow a lot of ideas from others, certainly. But you can rarely just copy and paste things, especially if you're going back to the past with different technology levels, because fundamentally, they're different states with different needs, different traditions, different precedents, and different scenarios they've had to tackle. You won't be able to do a one-to-one with any other state, so you have to build all the institutions from scratch. You can take inspiration, get ideas, certainly, but you cannot do it one-to-one. You have to make your own institutions. And that is rather difficult. Quote again, "There is nothing more difficult to take in hand, more perilous to conduct, or more uncertain in its success than to take the lead in the introduction of new things, because the innovator has for enemies those who have done well under the old conditions, and lukewarm defenders in those who may do well under the new." Essentially, a person who has sort of hitched their horse to the race under the old conditions, under that old constitution, those old beliefs, whatever, is naturally going to want to preserve them, and they're going to fight hard to do so because that's what they're used to and that's what they benefit from. They know what they get out of it. A feudal lord in the 1800s, when it was starting to be abolished in certain countries, knew exactly what he was getting out of the manor system and out of serfdom. He knew. But for those who would advocate for land reform, using that feudalism example, for the end of serfdom, they know it sounds good, sure, but how do they know it's going to work? How do they know that this new policy is going to be successful? They don't necessarily. You may use outside examples, but again, different conditions. Things are not going to always be one-to-one. And for this, you naturally have a more lukewarm position. A person who has seen the old conditions knows exactly what they got out of it, and they know what they're going to get if they reestablish it, more or less. A person who's pushing for something new does not know exactly what's going to come out of it. Sure, there are some easy predictions that one could make, theoretically, but there are never any certainties. There's never any guarantees. And so a person can simply ask, but will it really be as beneficial to me to be worth the risk? And so that's why they're lukewarm defenders. They have no guarantees that what they're going to pass is going to be beneficial. They don't have as much data to work on for their ideas as the old guard does for theirs. The old guard see their data. They know exactly what they get from their old position. The people pushing for the new do not, because they don't have the data yet. It takes a while for someone to accept something because they don't have as much information to say, okay, yeah, that was a good idea. Nowadays, we do have that data. We do see that serfdom was a net negative as opposed to completely free labor. But that does not mean those at the time knew the same. And indeed, with your system relying upon feudalism, it becomes hard to think in such a way as to remove it. Essentially, it is very hard to convince people to adopt something new, especially when it comes to the state and how it's run. Because people get used to things. And those who, well, let's face it, profit off of the current or the old system, like that they profit off it and wish to keep it. You don't have enough data to confirm that the new is necessarily better most of the time, and we do have enough data for the old guard to know that they want to keep things the way they are. And so any person establishing a new principality must get over that. They must find a way to sideline the old guard or otherwise placate them enough so that they don't get in their way, while building enough support from those willing to defend the new to establish them. If they cannot, then the new principality will not last, and it will relapse into its old position. That being a former principality, which could be anything from a state conquered, or an old form of a state for a certain people, such as going from the French Republic to the French monarchy and back. And here we later have a question for how to handle such things. To consummate, there we go, that's the word, their enterprise, the new state, have they to use prayers or can they use force? What Machiavelli, I do apologize for my butchering of the words. What Machiavelli, there we go, what he is trying to say, essentially, is that when it comes to the new state, can a prince safely rely on others to do the work for him? Can they just pray and hope that things will work out? Or can they use force to ensure that things do? And, as Machiavelli would later go on to explain, prayer and the reliance on luck ends poorly. Those who do not have the capabilities to defend their ideas or their position will find themselves toppled by those who are willing to do so to achieve their goals. And thus a prince must be willing and able to use force to maintain their rule. You must be willing to not only pick up the sword, but able to use it. If you cannot, then you will fall. It is a simple test to convince a person once. Even just a bribe is enough to convince people. But to keep them on side, it is necessary to be able to use force because, well, it is a great difficulty in maintaining one's convictions to a certain position. They may well waver, and you cannot afford to have that person step out of line and attempt to destroy you, because that is a good way to die. So a prince must be able to, if necessary, use force, even on erstwhile allies, to ensure that things go smoothly. Now, do not just use force wildly. That is not what Machiavelli is saying, but one must be able to use force, and willing to do so, if necessary. Continuing on. Other dangers are in the ascent, yet with ability they, the prince, will overcome them. But when these are overcome, and those who envied them their success are exterminated, they will begin to be respected, and they will continue afterwards powerful, secure, honored, and happy. Once again, a difference in English versus American spelling, But the important thing here is that, as Machiavelli is saying, when it comes to establishing a new territory, a new state, the challenge is in the establishment itself, the initial enemies of doing so. But once those enemies are eliminated, once the new institution's established and things start working as necessary, with precedents growing and compounding upon each other, things are stable. And importantly, the prince, or whoever the ruler is, will be respected. I mean, after all, if you are the person who established this new system, those who profit off the new system will care for you and respect you because it is in their interest to do so. They will be powerful because they have eliminated all their rivals, secure for the same reasons, and also because the new institutions have loyalty to them directly, honored for similar reasons, but importantly, because also they have established something new. They have achieved a Herculean task and completed it in such a way that they are secure. That is a thing that people will honor and respect. And, of course, after having succeeded, the prince themselves would be happy. Machiavelli's final example is a king of Syracuse. He uses it as a prime example of the establishment of a new principality. For this man, who, as a citizen, was able to become king and reorganize the state, did so in such a way that he, quote, had endured much trouble in acquiring, but had little trouble in keeping. Essentially, this king, who first became captain of the soldiers of Syracuse and then their king, was successfully able to replace the old military with a new one, secure new alliances to replace the old, and reestablish everything in such a way that he, specifically, he as ruler, was the one in control of Syracuse. Without question, there was no debate over whether or not the old guard still had power. He was in charge. He also was able to establish new institutions, successfully maintaining his control over the territory, and securing for himself, at least, full power, or at least enough to maintain his role as king. He is a man who succeeded in all these things. There are other examples that Machiavelli used throughout this chapter. Of the four, specifically, that I remember for successes, there was Moses, Cyrus, Romulus, and a fourth, which I am currently blanking on. Oh yeah, Theseus. For which we have Judea, Persia, Rome, the kingdom specifically, and Athens. All of these men, similar to this king of Syracuse, which Machiavelli used as an example, were able to achieve great things. Now, Machiavelli notes Moses out specifically because, being from the Bible, and importantly, supposedly being guided by God, it was a slightly different case for him. Because, well, hyper-religious time, but importantly, if a man is literally blessed by God, or whatever your religious figure is, good chance they're not going to fail. If there's a world in which there's a deity that can decide all things, and they bless a man to do a thing, there is no question that they're going to succeed. But Romulus, Cyrus, and Theseus had no such guarantees, and yet they still succeeded. Romulus still founded Rome, which would go on to become the center for a great republic, and then an empire. Theseus was able to reform Athens quite effectively. And Cyrus was able to found a Persian empire so strong that I believe estimates hold it as ruling up to 25% of the world population at the time. An empire which would only fall to one of the most skilled generals of the day, Alexander the Great. That is how effective the Persians were. They had fought pretty much everywhere on their borders, but it took until Alexander the Great, which, keep in mind, Alexander was a genius of a military leader with an extremely experienced and skilled soldiery. It is difficult to comprehend exactly how lucky, but also how incredibly powerful his army was. Like, to understand it within the average person's perspective. Cyrus created a state so strong that it took pretty much luck to a level that's hard to fathom, combined with one of the strongest armies and the strongest military leaders of pretty much a generation to succeed. These men, like Cyrus, like Romulus, and like Theseus, built strong states, which were able to hold up for a long time. Rome became a great empire. Athens dominated its Delian League and became still a prominent city to the point where it's now the Greek capital. Cyrus's Persia spread its culture and established a large amount of control over much of the Middle East. And, of course, the king of Syracuse, well, he ruled Syracuse, a powerful city which would only fall when Rome and Carthage started fighting over Sicily. The establishment of new principalities is, as its nature would imply, a very difficult task. It is a Herculean one. But if successful, if a ruler is able to do so, they will have some of the strongest and most reliable states that they could possibly think of. Because if it's built from the ground up, then every part of it was built with something in mind, specifically for the ruler who built it. And so that ruler and their family, who will succeed them, will be more able to hold it and use it appropriately. Even with a republic, this is true. For while it may not be the family, the inheritors of the republic, those political families that dominate when the republic is first being led, will naturally have amazing advantages purely because, with their connections and their relations to the initial founding, things will yield in a way that fits with their ideas and their structure. The U.S. is a great example. The founding fathers were all major believers in Enlightenment philosophy and English common law. So when they built their state, much of it was around such things, those principles. If you read the Declaration of Independence, it'll read practically like an endorsement of Enlightenment philosophy, if you understand what you're looking for. And so, while the establishment of new principalities certainly is not an easy one, it is far easier to rule a already existing state than to make a new one. Once established, they provide great boons to their rulers and are very useful. Thank you for watching. I do hope you enjoyed. I apologize for my constant slurring of my speech, but goodbye.